At Christmas dinner, my father-in-law stood up and said, "I'm proud of all my grandchildren. Except one." He pointed at my daughter. The table laughed. My daughter's eyes filled with tears. My younger son laughed and calmly pulled out a folder and said, "Speaking of pride, let's talk about your second family, Grandpa." My mother-in-law fainted. The December cold bit through Douglas Dean's jacket as he stood in the driveway of the Henderson estate, watching his daughter Abigail trace patterns in the frost on his car window. She was 12, quiet, and thoughtful with her mother's dark eyes and his own reserved nature. Unlike her brothers, she'd inherited his tendency to observe rather than perform, to think before speaking. Qualities that made her brilliant at chess but invisible at family gatherings. "Do we have to go, Dad?" Abigail's breath fogged the glass. Douglas crouched beside her. His 42 years of experience reading people telling him this wasn't simple pre-party nerves. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "Grandpa Richard always forgets my name. Last time he called me the quiet one the whole night." Her voice was small. "Blake gets to talk about his football trophies and Stephen gets to show his art. But when I try to tell Grandpa about winning the regional chess tournament, he just pats my head and walks away." Something cold settled in Douglas's chest that had nothing to do with the weather. He'd noticed the pattern, too. Had been noticing it for years. His father-in-law's calculated dismissal of Abigail, the way Richard Henderson lit up for his two grandsons, but glazed over when Abigail entered a room. Douglas had told himself it was generational preference, old-fashioned favoritism for boys. He'd been making excuses. "Come on," Douglas said, taking her hand. "Let's get through this together." Inside, the Henderson mansion gleamed with excessive Christmas decoration, the kind of display that screamed old money and desperate relevance. Douglas had grown up in a two-bedroom apartment above his father's auto shop in Detroit. He'd earned his mechanical engineering degree through night school, built a career designing industrial robotics, and made himself into something. But to Richard Henderson, he'd always be the grease monkey who'd gotten lucky marrying Candace. His wife appeared at the top of the curved staircase, elegant in a deep green dress. Candace Henderson Dean had her mother's refined features and her father's steel spine, though she'd spent 38 years learning to bend it to keep peace. She caught Douglas's eye, and he saw the familiar resignation there. The look that said, "Let's just survive tonight." Their sons thundered down behind her. Blake, 15 and built like a linebacker, carried his usual confidence like armor. Stephen, 17 and college-bound, had his portfolio under one arm, ready to impress. Both boys had inherited Candace's easier charm, her ability to navigate Richard's minefield personality. "Remember the rules," Candace said quietly as they entered the foyer. "Don't mention politics. Don't bring up the business. Let him tell his stories without correcting him. And Douglas. I know, don't mention that his self-made fortune started with his wife's family money." Douglas had heard the warnings for 14 years of marriage. Regina Henderson descended the stairs like fated royalty, her smile warm until it reached Douglas. "You're late." "We're 5 minutes early," Douglas replied evenly. "Richard expected you 10 minutes early." She turned to the children, her expression softening. "Stephen, darling, your grandfather wants to hear about your college applications." "Blake, he's in the study with Uncle Morris. Something about your last game." "And Abigail," Regina's pause was slight but sharp. "You can help in the kitchen." Douglas felt Abigail's hand tighten in his. Before he could object, Blake spoke up. "Actually, Grandma, Abby just won a big chess tournament. Grandpa would want to hear about that." Regina's smile didn't waver. "How nice. But the kitchen needs, I'll tell him myself." Richard Henderson's voice boomed from the study. He emerged, 73 years old and commanding every inch of space he occupied. Retired federal judge, former state congressman, current patriarch of a family dynasty built on railroad money and political connections. His eyes swept past Abigail like she was furniture. "Blake, my boy. Morris was just telling me about that touchdown. For Defenders." Douglas watched his father-in-law clasp Blake's shoulder, steering him toward the study where the men gathered. Stephen followed, portfolio ready. Candace squeezed Douglas's arm. A warning or plea, he couldn't tell anymore, and drifted toward her aunts in the sitting room. Abigail stood alone in the foyer, invisible. "Come on," Douglas said, leading her toward the kitchen. "Let's see if we can steal some of those cookies before dinner." But his mind was already working, cataloging, measuring. He'd spent 2 decades designing systems, finding weaknesses, creating solutions. Somewhere in this fortress of tradition and ego, there was a flaw. There always was. Dinner seated 23. The Henderson family gathered like this 4 times a year. Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, and the 4th of July. Each event followed the same script. Richard presided at the head of a table long enough to host a summit. Regina managed the performance from the opposite end, and everyone else played their assigned roles. Douglas sat halfway down, positioned as always, just far enough from Richard to make conversation difficult, but close enough to hear every word. Across from him, Candace's brother Morris and his wife Deborah discussed their son's acceptance to medical school. Next to them, Candace's sister Leanne and her husband Alfonso compared vacation homes. The successful children, the favored branches of the Henderson tree. Abigail had been seated at the far end near the kitchen doors between two elderly great-aunts who were both mostly deaf. Douglas had watched her shoulders slump when she realized her placement. Blake, however, had been positioned 2 seats from Richard, a place of honor. His younger son sat relaxed, listening to his grandfather's stories with what appeared to be genuine interest. But Douglas knew Blake better than that. His son's eyes were sharp, focused. He was studying Richard the way he studied opposing quarterbacks before a game, looking for patterns and weaknesses. Something had shifted in Blake over the past few months. The easygoing athlete had developed an edge, a quiet intensity that Douglas recognized because he saw it in his own mirror. They'd had several late-night conversations recently. Unusual for a teenage boy and his father. Blake had asked careful questions about justice, about what you did when the system failed, about whether some wrongs were too big to forgive. Douglas had assumed it was philosophical teenage rebellion against establishment thinking. Now watching Blake watched Richard, he wondered if his son had been preparing for something. "I want to make a toast," Richard announced, rising from his chair. The table fell silent immediately. Richard's word was law at these gatherings. He raised his wine glass and everyone followed suit. "Another year, another Christmas with my family. My legacy." Douglas saw Abigail reach for her glass of sparkling cider. "I'm proud of all my grandchildren," Richard continued, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he'd used from the bench for 30 years. His eyes moved across the younger faces. Stephen Blake, Morris's son, Jeremy, Leanne's daughter, Samantha. They're carrying the Henderson name forward with distinction. The pause was deliberate. Douglas felt it coming like a wave building offshore. All of them except one. Richard's finger extended, pointing directly at Abigail. "That one there. The strange, quiet one who can't even look people in the eye. What good is a Henderson who can't command a room?" The table erupted in uncomfortable laughter? Not the full-throated kind, but the nervous social laughter of people who knew they were witnessing something cruel, but didn't have the courage to object. Morris chuckled. Leanne covered her mouth but her eyes sparkled. Even Deborah smiled, caught up in the moment. Douglas looked at Candace. His wife had gone pale, her knuckles white around her wine glass. But she said nothing. Abigail's face crumpled, tears welled in her dark eyes as she stared at her plate, trying to make herself even smaller than her grandfather believed her to be. The engineer and Douglas calculated trajectories, the distance to Richard's chair, the weight of the wine bottle, the satisfaction of watching crystal shatter against that smug face. But he'd learned long ago that violence was the tool of men who couldn't think their way through problems. Then Blake stood up. The laughter died. 15 years old, 6'2", with the calm confidence of someone who just decided to change everything, Blake reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder. "Speaking of pride," Blake said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room. "Let's talk about your second family, Grandpa," Regina gasped. Richard's face went from ruddy to purple. "What did you say?" "Your second family in Portland." Blake opened the folder, pulling out a photograph. He held it up for the table to see Richard Henderson, maybe 5 years younger, his arm around a woman who wasn't Regina. Behind them, 2 teenagers smiled at the camera. "This is Sonia Richardson and her kids, right, Theodore and Jennifer. They live in a nice house on Maple Street. You've been paying their mortgage for 18 years. The photograph passed from hand to hand like a live grenade. Douglas watched faces transform. Shock, confusion, dawning horror. Morris's mouth hung open. Lean had gone white. Candace stared at her father like she'd never seen him before. Regina swayed in her chair. For a moment, Douglas thought she might speak, might defend her husband, or demand proof. Instead, her eyes rolled back, and she pitched forward, unconscious before her face hit the mashed potatoes. The chaos that followed Regina's collapse bought Douglas precious seconds to watch his father-in-law. While Morris and Alfonso rushed to help Regina, while Candace shouted for someone to call 911, while the great aunts clutched their pearls and Deborah fanned Regina with a napkin, Douglas stayed seated and observed. Richard Henderson didn't move to help his wife. He stood frozen, staring at Blake with an expression Douglas had never seen before. Pure, undiluted fear. Not the fear of consequences or embarrassment, but the terror of a man watching his carefully constructed world crack apart. Then Richard's eyes found Douglas. The two men locked gazes across the holiday table, and Douglas saw the exact moment his father-in-law understood. This wasn't teenage rebellion or lucky discovery. This was calculated. This was war. You, Richard hissed. You put him up to this. Douglas said nothing, but he didn't break eye contact. Let Richard wonder. Let him spiral. Regina regained consciousness to find her sister Iris and daughter Leanne hovering over her. She pushed them away weakly, her eyes finding Richard. Tell me it's not true, she whispered. Tell me he's lying. Mother, don't. Leanne started, but Regina cut her off. Tell me. The scream was raw. Decades of suspicion and swallowed pride erupting all at once. Richard's jaw worked. The judge who'd sentenced hundreds of criminals, the politician who'd commanded crowds, the patriarch who ruled his family with absolute authority. He had nothing. The silence stretched until Blake spoke again. There's more, Blake said quietly. He pulled out another document. Should I keep going, or do you want to tell them yourself? Blake, that's enough, Candace said, finding her voice. She looked at Douglas, her expression a mixture of shock and something else. Betrayal perhaps. Did you know about this? Douglas stood, moving to where Abigail sat trembling. He pulled his daughter into his arms, feeling her shake against his chest. I knew, he said simply. Blake and I both knew. How long? Morris demanded. How long have you been sitting on this? Does it matter? Douglas met Morris's glare. Your father just humiliated my daughter in front of the entire family. He's done it for years. I'm done making excuses for him. So you ambush us at Christmas dinner. Leanne's voice was shrill. You turn our family gathering into a circus. Your father did that. Blake said, still calm. We just revealed it. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes. Though Regina refused to go to the hospital, she stood on shaking legs supported by Iris and pointed at the door. Everyone out. Family only. We are family. Douglas said, not you. Regina's voice was ice. Never you. I knew Candace marrying beneath herself would bring us shame eventually. Candace flinched like she'd been slapped. Mother, get out of my house. Douglas gathered his children. Stephen moved automatically, his artist's eyes taking in everything for later processing. Blake pocketed the folder. His job done. Abigail clung to Douglas's hand, tears still streaming down her face, but head held higher than before. At the door, Douglas turned back. The remaining Hendersons clustered around Regina like wounded animals, except Richard, who stood alone by the head of the table, still holding his wine glass. This isn't over, Richard said quietly. You have no idea what you've started. Douglas smiled, a thin, cold expression that never reached his eyes. Actually, I know exactly what I've started. The drive home was silent, except for Abigail's occasional sniffles. Candace stared out the window, her face unreadable. Stephen sat with his sketchbook closed. Blake watched the streets pass, still carrying that focused calm. It wasn't until they were inside their own house. A comfortable colonial in a good neighborhood earned through Douglas's work and careful planning. That Candace finally exploded. What the hell was that? She whirled on Douglas. 14 years of marriage and buried resentment erupting. You knew about my father's other family and you said nothing. You let Blake ambush him at Christmas dinner. I let Blake defend his sister. Douglas corrected. There's a difference. You humiliated my mother. She fainted. Douglas. The whole family. Your mother has known for years. Blake interrupted. She had too. The money, the trips to Portland, the separate phone. She knew and she chose to ignore it. Candace turned to her son. How did you even find this out? I've been investigating Grandpa for 6 months. Blake moved to the dining room table and opened his laptop. It started when I noticed how he treated Abby. I thought maybe there was something in his past, some reason he was such a jerk. And I found it. He pulled up files, photographs, financial records, emails. Douglas had seen them all before. He and Blake had gone through everything together, verifying each piece of evidence, building their case. Theodore Richardson is 18. Blake continued. Jennifer is 16. Sonia Richardson was Richard's law clerk back in 2007. He got her pregnant, set her up in Portland, and has been paying her off ever since. The house, the cars, the kids' private school, all funded through a shell corporation called Henderson Consulting. That's over $1 million, Stephen said. Finally speaking, he'd moved closer to look at the laptop. Over 18 years with the house and everything. Jesus, my father wouldn't. Candace started, but her voice lacked conviction. Your father absolutely would, Douglas said. And he did. Blake found the proof. We verified it. All of it. Candace sank into a chair, her perfect composure finally breaking. Why didn't you tell me? Douglas crouched in front of her, taking her hands. Because I needed you to see it happen. If I told you beforehand, you would have warned him or talked me out of it or convinced yourself I was wrong. You've been making excuses for Richard your whole life. He's my father and Abigail is our daughter. Douglas's voice hardened. He's been treating her like she's worthless since she was born. Tonight was the final straw, but it's been building for years. The forgotten birthdays, the dismissive comments, the way he lights up for the boys, but looks through her like she's invisible. I won't let her grow up thinking that's acceptable. Abigail appeared in the doorway, still in her Christmas dress. I heard you fighting. Candace opened her arms and Abigail ran to her. Both of them crying now. Douglas stepped back, giving them space while his mind continued working. Tonight was just the opening move. Richard Henderson wouldn't accept this exposure lying down. A man with his connections, his resources, his ego, he'd fight back. Douglas was counting on it. Blake closed his laptop and looked at his father. In that moment, Douglas saw himself reflected back. The same calculating intelligence, the same willingness to do what others wouldn't. What's next? Blake asked quietly. Now we wait, Douglas said. He'll make his move soon. And when he does, we'll be ready. Stephen finally spoke up, his voice thoughtful. There's more, isn't there? More than just the second family. Douglas met his eldest son's eyes and saw the same sharp understanding. Both his boys had inherited his analytical mind. They just applied it differently. Blake to strategy and execution. Stephen to observation and pattern recognition. Much more, Douglas confirmed. The second family is just what people can understand. What comes next? He paused, choosing his words carefully. Let's just say Richard Henderson built his life on secrets. We've barely scratched the surface. Candace looked up from embracing Abigail, her face streaked with tears and makeup. What are you planning, Douglas? Justice, he said simply. Your father has hurt people for decades. Used his power, his position, his family name to crush anyone who got in his way. It's time someone held him accountable. This isn't just about Abigail, is it? Candace's voice was quiet. It's about you. About how he's treated you. She's small. Richard snapped a weak quiet nothing he'll never amount to. Douglas hung up. The phone rang again immediately. He ignored it. It rang 7 more times before finally stopping. Blake appeared in the workshop doorway already dressed for school despite it being winter break. That was Grandpa making threats. How's your mom still processing? She didn't sleep. Blake moved to the workbench, examining the servo mechanism Douglas had been adjusting. Uncle Morris called and Aunt Leanne. They want her to convince you to apologize and take it all back. Of course they do. The Henderson family protects its own. Not Abby, apparently. Blake's jaw tightened. She's part of the family, too. Not to them. Douglas handed his son a screwdriver. Here, help me with this. I need to calibrate the tension. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes. The kind of peace that only came from shared purpose. Douglas had taught all 3 children basic engineering, but Blake had taken to it naturally. The boy understood systems, how small adjustments could create massive changes. Dad, Blake said eventually. That thing you mentioned last night about barely scratching the surface. What else is there? Douglas considered his answer carefully. Blake was 15, old enough to understand consequences, but young enough to still believe in absolute right and wrong. What Douglas was planning went beyond simple exposure. It was dismantling a man's entire legacy piece by piece. But Blake deserved the truth. Your grandfather has been a federal judge, a state congressman, and a pillar of the community for over 40 years, Douglas began. In that time, he's made deals, accepted favors, and bent the law to benefit himself and his friends. The second family is embarrassing, but it's not illegal. What we found in his financial records, his email archives, his personal files, that's different. The bribe you mentioned, one of several. Richard Henderson has been on the take for decades, construction contracts steered to specific companies in exchange for campaign donations, favorable rulings in civil cases for defendants who made the right contributions. He's even helped cover up crimes. There's a hit and run from 2015 where the driver was the son of Richard's golf buddy. The case was dismissed due to lack of evidence even though there were 3 witnesses. Blake's hand stilled. That's Dad. That's serious. It's criminal. If exposed properly, it would destroy him completely. Prison time, disgrace, losing everything. Then why haven't you done it yet? Douglas met his son's eyes. Because I needed Richard to make the first move. I needed him to show his true nature, not just to me, but to everyone who's been enabling him. Last night, Your mother saw who her father really is. Today, he's threatening my job, trying to intimidate us. By the time I'm done, no one will be able to claim they didn't know what kind of man Richard Henderson really was. You're building a case. I'm building a guillotine. And when it falls, I want there to be no doubt that Richard Henderson deserves what happens to him. Blake absorbed this, his young face serious. What do you need me to do right now? Be there for your sister. Help your mother process this and keep watching your grandfather. Desperate men make mistakes, and Richard is about to get very desperate indeed. As if on cue, Douglas's phone buzzed. Not a call this time, but a text from an unknown number. Your daughter will regret this. All of you will. Douglas showed it to Blake. And it begins. They spent the next hour finishing the servo mechanism, discussing engineering principles and football strategy, and what Blake wanted to study in college. Normal father-son conversation, the kind they'd had hundreds of times before. But underneath ran a current of shared purpose, of understanding that they were in this together. When Candace appeared in the workshop doorway, she looked exhausted but resolute. We need to talk, all of us. The family gathered in the living room. Candace on the couch with Abigail curled against her, Stephen in his usual armchair with his sketchbook, Blake standing near the window, and Douglas in the center waiting. I called my mother this morning. Candace began. She's not well. The doctor came by. Panic attack, elevated blood pressure. She wants to see me alone, Douglas asked. With the kids, not you. Candace's voice held no judgment, just fact. I'll go, Abigail said quietly. Everyone looked at her. The girl who'd been mocked 12 hours earlier, who'd spent the night crying, who had every reason to never want to see her grandparents again. Sweetheart, you don't have to. Candace started. I want to. Abigail sat up straighter. I want Grandma to see me. Really see me. And I want to ask Grandpa why he hates me so much. The simple courage in her voice made Douglas's chest tight. This was his daughter, the one Richard called weak and worthless. She had more strength than the old judge would ever understand. Okay, Douglas said. But I'm driving you there and I'm waiting outside. At the first sign of trouble, you call me. Candace nodded. I'll protect them. Will you? The question came out harsher than Douglas intended, but it needed to be asked. Yesterday, you would have made excuses for him. Today, you're taking our children back to his house. How do I know you won't fold when he turns on the charm or your mother starts crying? Candace's eyes flashed. Because yesterday, I still had illusions about my father. Today, I don't. He pointed at our daughter and mocked her in front of the entire family. He has a second family that he's been hiding for 18 years. And apparently her voice hardened. He's also a corrupt judge who takes bribes and covers up crimes. So no, Douglas, I won't fold. Not anymore. You believe me? About the rest of it. I believe Blake found something 3 years ago that started all this. I believe you've been investigating my father ever since. And I believe that if you say you have proof, you have proof. She met his gaze steadily. I also believe that you're going to destroy him. And honestly, after what he did to Abby, I think he deserves it. Douglas felt something unlock in his chest. Relief, validation, renewed purpose. Having Candace on his side changed everything. There's something you should know, Stephen said suddenly. All eyes turned to him. I've been sketching at Grandpa's house for years. Family gatherings, holidays. He never pays attention to me drawing in the corner. He opened his sketchbook, flipping through pages of detailed illustrations. The Henderson mansion, family portraits, and interspersed throughout images Douglas had never seen. Richard in his study, talking to men Douglas didn't recognize. Morris handing his father an envelope. Leanne and Richard in what looked like a heated argument. I date everything, Stephen continued. July 2019, that's Grandpa meeting with Francisco Ogden, the contractor who got the City Hall renovation contract. September 2020. That's Uncle Morris giving Grandpa cash before Morris's zoning variance got approved. March 2021, Aunt Leanne arguing with Grandpa right before her DUI charge disappeared. You've been documenting his corruption without even knowing it, Douglas said in wonder. Douglas didn't deny it. It's about all of us. Every person he's looked down on. Every time he's wielded his privilege like a weapon. Yes, seeing him humiliate our daughter was the catalyst. But the investigation that started long before tonight. How long? 3 years. Blake answered. Since the summer I turned 12. Dad found something in Grandpa's study during the July 4th party. We've been gathering evidence ever since. Candace looked between her husband and son. Seeing them clearly perhaps for the first time, not as the mechanic's son and the football player, but as something else entirely. Something dangerous when motivated. What did you find? She whispered. 3 years ago. What started this? Douglas remembered that day perfectly. He'd gone looking for a bathroom on the mansion's second floor and stumbled into Richard's private office. The door had been left ajar, the computer on, and there displayed on the screen had been an email that changed everything. Evidence of a bribe, Douglas said. A federal judge accepting money to influence a case. Your father sold his integrity for $100,000 and destroyed an innocent man's life in the process. That man killed himself 2 months after the verdict. The room went silent except for the grandfather clock ticking in the hall. Candace's face had gone white again, but this time she didn't defend Richard. She just sat there holding Abigail, letting the truth sink in. So, what happens now? Stephen asked. Douglas looked at his family, his brilliant, wounded daughter, his fierce, strategic younger son, his talented, perceptive older son, and his wife. Caught between the family she was born into and the family she'd built. Now he said, we tear down an empire. Richard Henderson's counterattack came at dawn. Douglas was in his home workshop, a converted garage where he designed prototype robotics and taught his children engineering principles when his phone rang. The number was blocked, but he answered anyway. Dean? The voice was cold, controlled. Richard had recovered his composure. We need to talk. I have nothing to say to you. Then listen. Papers rustled. I've already spoken to my attorney. What you did last night constitutes defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and criminal harassment. I'm prepared to file suit against you and your delinquent son for $10 million. Douglas smiled, continuing his work on a delicate servo mechanism. Go ahead. Discovery should be interesting. You think you're clever. Richard's control was slipping. You think embarrassing me in front of my family gives you power. But you're a nobody, Dean. A grease monkey who got lucky. I've crushed better men than you. I'm sure you have. That's the problem. What? You spent your whole life crushing people, using your position to hurt those who couldn't fight back. But you made a mistake with me, Richard. Douglas set down his tools. I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not interested in your money or your name or your approval. All I want is to watch you fall. Richard laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You're insane. You've destroyed your own marriage for some petty revenge fantasy. Candace will never forgive you for this. Candace loves our daughter more than she fears you. She'll make the right choice, will she? Richard's voice turned sly. I've already had several conversations this morning. Your employer, Titan Robotics, isn't it? I've known Bernard Bell for 20 years. We golf together. One phone call and you'll be unemployed by Monday. Douglas had expected this. Bernard Bell was the CEO of Titan Robotics, and yes, he was part of Richard's social circle. But Douglas had prepared for this contingency, too. You could try, Douglas said. But Bernard values results over connections. I hold 17 patents that have generated over $30 million in revenue for Titan. My last performance review was exceptional, and I've already documented this conversation for my attorney. Threatening someone's employment in retaliation for revealing your affairs. That's blackmail, Richard. Ask your lawyer friend how that plays in court. The silence stretched. Douglas could almost hear Richard's mind working, recalculating his approach. What do you want? Richard finally asked. Money? I'll pay you to keep quiet about Portland. Name your price. I don't want your money. Then what? I want you to understand something. Douglas's voice hardened. For 12 years, I watched you treat my daughter like she was worthless. For 12 years, I told myself to be patient, to keep the peace, to let it go. But last night, you pointed at her in front of the entire family and mocked her. You made her cry. You made her feel small. I just drew what I saw. But yeah, I guess I have. Stephen looked uncomfortable. I didn't want to believe he was really that bad. I kept telling myself there were explanations. But after last night, you're ready to help. Blake finished. Stephen nodded. What he did to Abby. That was cruel. And if he's been hurting other people, too, then yeah, I'm in. Douglas looked at his family, his wife finally seeing clearly, his sons ready to fight. His daughter finding her courage. Richard Henderson had spent his life crushing people who couldn't fight back. He'd never faced someone who could match his intelligence, who had the patience to build a case, who had everything to gain from his downfall and nothing to lose. Then here's what we do. Douglas said, Candace, you take the kids to see Regina. Let her cry. Let her plead. Let her try to make this go away, but don't give an inch. Abigail, you ask Richard your question. Look him in the eye and ask why he hates you. Make him say it out loud. What if he hurts her? Candace asked. He won't. Not physically. That's not his style. He'll try to manipulate her, make her feel guilty, convince her this is all her fault. But Abby's stronger than he thinks. Douglas smiled at his daughter. Aren't you? Abigail nodded, tears in her eyes, but chin raised. Stephen, I need you to make copies of those sketches. Date and label everything. Blake, you know what to do. Blake pulled out his phone, opening an encrypted app. I've got someone watching Grandpa's house. As soon as they see movement, we'll know. Candace blinked. You have someone watching. Edward O'Neill from my computer science class. His dad's a private investigator. Eduardo's been teaching me surveillance techniques. Blake shrugged. I take my hobby seriously. Douglas had to suppress a laugh. His 15-year-old son had recruited a teenage surveillance team. All right, everyone knows their role. Let's give Richard Henderson exactly what he deserves, the truth. The Henderson mansion looked different in daylight after the previous night's disaster. The Christmas decorations seemed garish now, excessive and desperate. Douglas pulled into the circular driveway and watched Morris's BMW and Leanne's Mercedes already parked near the entrance. The whole family's here, Candace observed. My father must have called an emergency meeting. Good, Blake said from the back seat. More witnesses. Douglas turned to look at his children. Stephen sat with his sketchbook and a folder of copied drawings. Blake had his phone and his usual unshakable calm. Abigail looked small but determined, dressed in a simple blue dress that made her look older than 12. Remember, Douglas said, you're not there to fight. You're there to observe and report. Let Richard talk. Let him reveal himself. Can you do that? 3 nods. Candace squeezed his hand once, then led the children to the door. Douglas watched them disappear inside before pulling out his phone and dialing. Eduardo, they're in. Start recording. Already on it, Mr. Dean. I've got visual on the living room and study through the windows. Audio's a bit fuzzy, but workable. Good. Keep me updated. Douglas waited, monitoring his phone. Eduardo's surveillance was technically illegal, but Douglas had learned long ago that sometimes you had to bend rules to expose those who broke them entirely. Besides, everything they captured would eventually be cross-referenced with legal documentation. This was insurance. Inside the mansion, Candace later told him the Henderson family had assembled like a war council. Richard sat in his leather armchair, still dressed in yesterday's suit, as if he'd never changed. Regina perched on the sofa, supported by her sister, Iris. Morris and Leanne flanked their parents, presenting a united front. I'm glad you came, Richard said, not looking at Candace, but at the children. We need to discuss last night's incident. You mean when you humiliated Abigail? Candace's voice was ice. I meant Blake's outrageous accusations, Richard corrected. Lies told by a troubled teenager encouraged by your unstable husband. They weren't lies, Blake said calmly. I have documentation, photographs, financial records, forged documents, Morris interjected. We've already spoken to our attorneys. This is a clear case of I wanted to ask you something, Grandpa. Abigail's small voice cut through the room like a knife. Everyone stopped talking. Richard's jaw tightened, but he couldn't ignore a direct address from his granddaughter without looking even worse. What? Why do you hate me? Abigail's voice didn't waver. I've tried so hard to make you proud. I win chess tournaments. I get straight A's. I volunteer at the animal shelter, but you act like I'm invisible. Last night, you pointed at me and told everyone I was worthless. I just want to know why. The room went silent. Regina made a small sound, quickly stifled. Leanne looked uncomfortable. Even Morris had the grace to appear embarrassed. Richard stared at his granddaughter, and for a moment, something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt, but close to it. Then it hardened into the familiar arrogance. You want the truth, he said. Fine. You remind me of your father. Weak, quiet, always watching. You don't have the Henderson spirit. Your brothers do. They're fighters, leaders. But you're just like that mechanic who got lucky marrying my daughter. Dad? Candace's voice was shocked. What? She asked. Richard turned his glare on Candace. And while we're being honest, this whole mess is your fault. You married beneath yourself, brought that man into our family, and now look what's happened. Your marriage has poisoned our entire bloodline. Careful, Richard, Regina said quietly. You're going too far. I'm tired of being careful. I'm tired of pretending that Douglas Dean is good enough for my daughter. I'm tired of watching my legacy be tarnished by his inferior genetics and his lower class. You're the one who tarnished your legacy, Stephen interrupted. He opened his sketchbook, pulling out a drawing. This is you meeting with Francisco Ogden in July 2019. 2 weeks later, Ogden got the City Hall contract even though his bid was 20% higher than the competition. Want to explain that? Richard's face went purple. How dare you? I have 47 drawings, Stephen continued. All dated, all documented. Meetings with contractors, cash exchanges with Uncle Morris, private conversations that don't look very legal. I didn't understand what I was seeing until Dad explained it. But now I do. Those are nothing, Lean said quickly. Just family business, private meetings. Then why did my DUI disappear after Grandpa and I talked? Stephen pulled out another drawing. This is from March 2021. Aunt Leanne arguing with Grandpa. She was crying. 2 days later, the police report vanished and the charges were dropped. I remember because Dad told Mom it was suspicious how quickly it all went away. Leanne went white. Morris stood abruptly. This is extortion. You're trying to blackmail us. We're exposing corruption. Blake corrected. There's a difference. Grandpa has spent decades using his position for personal gain. The second family in Portland is just the beginning. Wait until people hear about the bribes, the favors, the covered-up crimes. Regina stood on shaking legs. Stop this. All of you. Stop. This is our family. No, Mother. Candace said. This is the truth. And maybe it's time we faced it instead of hiding behind the Henderson name. Richard's control finally snapped. He lunged from his chair toward Blake, but Morris caught him. You ungrateful. I could destroy you. All of you. I have connections. Power. You have secrets, Blake said calmly. And we have proof. Push us and we release everything. Every bribe, every favor, every covered-up crime. Your career, your reputation, your freedom, all gone. You wouldn't dare try us. The standoff held for a long moment. Then Abigail spoke again, her voice still quiet but clear. I don't hate you, Grandpa. I wanted to after last night, but I just feel sad for you because you have all this. She gestured at the mansion, the family, the trappings of success. And you're still so mean. You're still so empty inside that you have to hurt people to feel big. Dad taught me that people who bully others are just scared and small themselves. I think he's right. Richard stared at her, and for the first time, Douglas later learned the great Richard Henderson had absolutely nothing to say. Candace gathered her children. We're leaving. And Mother, you need to decide who you are. Are you going to keep defending a man who's betrayed you, corrupted his office, and hurt his own family, or are you going to be the woman I thought you were? Regina didn't answer. She just sank back onto the sofa, tears streaming down her face. They left the mansion in silence. It wasn't until they were in the car that Abigail finally broke down, crying against her mother's shoulder, while Blake and Stephen sat on either side, protective and proud. Douglas drove them home, his phone lighting up with Eduardo's texts. Got everything. Audio's crystal clear. Holy, your daughter is a badass. Yes, Douglas thought. Yes, she is. The next 72 hours moved like a carefully orchestrated symphony. Douglas had spent 3 years preparing for this, and now all the pieces were falling into place. First, Bernard Bell from Titan Robotics called. Douglas, I need to know what's going on. Richard Henderson called me this morning demanding I fire you. Said you were harassing his family, spreading lies. I told him to go to hell, but I need to hear your side. Douglas gave him the condensed version. The second family, the humiliation of Abigail, the evidence of corruption. Bernard was silent for a long moment. Jesus, he finally said, I've known Richard for years. Had no idea. Listen, your job is safe. More than safe. And Douglas, I sit on the State Bar Association. If you have real evidence of judicial corruption, I know people who'd want to see it. Second, Domino, then Morris called trying a different approach. Douglas, we need to talk Monto man. What you and Blake did was wrong, but maybe we can work this out. Richard's willing to apologize to Abigail if you'll keep quiet about the Portland situation. Not interested. He'll pay you. Name your price. I don't want his money. Then what do you want? I want him to face consequences for once in his privileged life. I want him to understand that he can't hurt people without accountability. And I want my daughter to see that bullies don't always win. Morris's voice turned ugly. You're making a huge mistake. The Henderson family has resources you can't imagine. We will destroy you. Try. Third domino. The family closing ranks, showing their true nature. Douglas had been recording all calls, documenting every threat. Blake's surveillance team, 3 teenage computer science students who thought they were just helping with a school project, had captured extensive footage of the Henderson mansion. Cars coming and going, late-night meetings. On the second night, they caught someone burning documents in the backyard fire pit. That's Uncle Morris, Blake identified. Destroying evidence, probably. Good, Douglas said. That shows consciousness of guilt. Eduardo, can you get me a copy of that footage? Already done. Also, you might want to see this. Eduardo pulled up another video file. This is from this afternoon. Woman showed up at the mansion, argued with Richard for 20 minutes, then left crying. Douglas recognized her from Blake's Portland files. That's Sonia Richardson, the second family. She looked pissed. Fourth domino. Richard's carefully separated lives colliding. On day 3, Douglas received an unexpected visitor. Regina Henderson appeared at his door alone, looking 10 years older than she had at Christmas dinner. "We need to talk," she said. "May I come in?" Douglas led her to the living room. Candace emerged from the kitchen, freezing when she saw her mother. "I'll leave," Candace said stiffly. "No, stay," Regina's voice was firm. "You both need to hear this." They sat in uncomfortable silence until Regina finally spoke. "I've known about Portland for 12 years. Not the whole time, but since 2013. I found hotel receipts, saw the credit card charges. I confronted Richard and he admitted it. Said it was over, said he'd made a mistake." "It wasn't over," Candace said quietly. "No, it wasn't. He kept lying and I kept pretending to believe him because the alternative." Regina's voice broke. "The alternative was admitting my marriage was a sham, that the man I'd built my life around was a fraud." Douglas said nothing, letting her talk. "But it's more than just the affair." Regina continued. "I've seen things over the years. Conversations that ended when I entered the room. Money appearing and disappearing. Richard making phone calls at odd hours. I told myself it was just business, just politics. But I knew deep down I always knew something was wrong." "Why are you telling us this?" Candace asked. Regina met her daughter's eyes. "Because I'm tired of being complicit. Because what Richard did to Abigail was unforgivable. And because," she paused, visibly struggling. "Because you were right. I need to decide who I am. And I'm choosing my granddaughter over my husband's ego." She pulled an envelope from her purse, handing it to Douglas. "This is Richard's personal email password and the code to his home safe. Inside the safe, you'll find documents he doesn't want anyone to see. Financial records, correspondence, things that will support whatever case you're building." Douglas took the envelope, stunned. "Why?" "Because Abigail asked him why he hated her, and his answer was cruel and wrong. Because I've watched him hurt people for decades and done nothing. Because it's time someone held Richard Henderson accountable." Regina stood. "I'm filing for divorce. I wanted you to know before I tell him tomorrow." After Regina left, Douglas opened the envelope. Inside was everything he needed. Access to Richard's most carefully guarded secrets. "Your mother just gave us a nuclear weapon," he told Candace. "Good," she replied. "Use it." That night, Douglas accessed Richard's email. What he found exceeded his darkest suspicions. 17 years of corruption documented in detail. Bribes accepted, cases fixed, criminals protected. Richard hadn't just bent the law. He'd broken it so often that it became routine. But it was the message from 2018 that made Douglas's blood run cold. Ogden's son hit that pedestrian. Kid was in the crosswalk. Driver was drunk. Witnesses saw everything. "I'm making it go away. Charging Ogden $200,000 for the favor. Between you and me, that pedestrian was nobody important. Just some mechanic from the east side. No family to make noise. Perfect candidate for an unsolvable case." Douglas read it 3 times. A hit and run covered up by Richard for money. The victim was identified in the attached police report. Thomas Dean, his father, the auto shop owner who'd raised Douglas alone after his mother died. The man who taught him to fix engines and think systematically, who'd scraped together money for Douglas's college despite barely keeping the shop afloat, who died in what police called a tragic unsolved hit and run 7 years ago. Douglas had grieved, moved on, told himself there was no justice for working-class victims of drunk drivers who fled the scene. He'd never imagined it went deeper than that. But Richard Henderson had made it go away, had taken money to bury the evidence, had literally profited from Thomas Dean's death. Blake found his father in the workshop at 3 a.m. staring at a printed email. "Dad, you okay?" Douglas looked up and Blake flinched at the expression on his face. "My father," Douglas said quietly. "The hit and run that killed him. It wasn't random. Richard covered it up for money." Blake went pale. "Oh my God. Francisco Ogden's son drunk driving killed my father and drove away. Richard took $200,000 to make sure no one ever paid for it." Douglas's hands shook. "This whole time, all these years, Richard looked me in the eye at every family gathering, knowing he'd helped murder my father. Dad, I thought this was about justice for Abigail, about exposing corruption." Douglas's voice was hollow, "But it's bigger than that now. So much bigger." Blake sat beside his father, both of them silent in the workshop where Douglas had taught his sons the skills his own father had taught him. "What are you going to do?" Blake finally asked. Douglas looked at his son, 15 years old, fierce and loyal, ready to follow wherever this led. "I'm going to bury him," he said completely and absolutely. "Richard Henderson destroyed my father to make a profit. Now I'm going to destroy everything he's ever built." "How?" Methodically, thoroughly, and legally, Douglas stood, moving to his computer. "We're taking this to the FBI, to the state bar, to every journalist who listen. We're going to expose every single crime Richard Henderson has committed for the past 4 decades. That's going to destroy the whole family. Uncle Morris, Aunt Leanne, they're all tangled up in his corruption." "I know," Douglas's jaw set, "but some things matter more than family loyalty. Justice matters. Truth matters. My father's memory matters." Blake nodded slowly. "Then let's do it right. Let's make sure when Richard falls, he can never get back up." Over the next week, Douglas built his case with the precision of an engineer designing a complex system. Every document cross-referenced, every email verified, every bribe traced. Stephen's sketches provided visual timeline. Blake's financial analysis showed money flows. Regina's testimony would establish motive and opportunity. But Douglas's masterstroke was something none of them expected. He'd found buried in Richard's files evidence that Sonia Richardson wasn't the second family. She was the third. There had been another woman, another child years before. A child Richard had abandoned when she was born with severe disabilities, paying off the mother to disappear and never contact him again. That child, now 26, was named Jennifer Morales. She'd grown up in poverty, disabled, and forgotten, while Richard lived in his mansion and preached about family values. Douglas found her through old emails. She was living in a state facility, her mother dead from cancer 3 years prior, with no family and no resources. Richard's payments had stopped the moment her mother died. "This is it," Douglas told Candace. "This is who he really is, a man who abandons his disabled child to save his reputation." Douglas visited Jennifer personally, bringing Candace and the children. They met her in the common room of the facility, a woman with cerebral palsy, sharp-eyed and intelligent despite her physical limitations. "You're Richard Henderson's son-in-law." Jennifer's speech was labored but clear. "Yes. And I'm here to tell you that you have a family. Half-sisters, a mother, nieces, and nephews who didn't know you existed." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "He told my mother I was too damaged to acknowledge that I would embarrass the family name. He was wrong." Candace knelt beside Jennifer's wheelchair, taking her hand. "You're my sister, and you deserve better than what he gave you." That moment, Douglas knew, was worth more than all the revenge in the world. But he was going to get both. The press conference was held on January 15th, 3 weeks after Christmas dinner. Douglas had coordinated with the FBI, the State Bar Association, and 2 investigative journalists from major newspapers. Bernard Bell had used his connections to ensure the right people paid attention. The Henderson mansion was surrounded by cameras as federal agents executed search warrants. Richard's computers, files, and financial records were seized. Morris's construction company offices were raided simultaneously. Leanne's home, where she'd stored documents related to her DUI cover-up, was searched. Douglas stood outside with his family, watching the Henderson empire crumble. Richard emerged in handcuffs, his face a mask of rage. He spotted Douglas and tried to lunge toward him, but the agents held him back. "You destroyed me," Richard screamed over a stupid Christmas dinner comment. "Over nothing." "Not nothing." Douglas called back. "Over my daughter. Over my father. Over every person you've hurt and every law you've broken. This is accountability. Richard. It's what you've avoided your whole life." The cameras captured everything. Richard's rage. His daughter Candace standing with Douglas. His granddaughter Abigail holding her father's hand with quiet dignity. Regina appeared at the mansion door, dry-eyed and composed. She'd already filed for divorce and was cooperating with investigators. She made a brief statement. "I'm ashamed I didn't act sooner. I'm grateful to my son-in-law for having the courage I lacked." The news cycle exploded. Federal Judge Richard Henderson arrested on multiple corruption charges. Secret families and abandoned disabled child. The fall of a legal dynasty. How a Christmas dinner exposed decades of judicial corruption. Stephen's sketches appeared in newspapers as evidence of long-term criminal conspiracy. Blake's financial analysis showed how Richard had stolen an estimated $3.7 million through various schemes. Jennifer Morales gave a tearful interview about her abandonment. But it was Abigail's statement that went viral. A 12-year-old girl speaking clearly to cameras. "My grandfather told me I was worthless. He was wrong. I'm strong. I'm smart. And I deserve respect. So did all the people he hurt over the years. I'm glad my dad and brothers helped make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. The trial took 9 months. Douglas testified about his father's death, about discovering the cover-up, about years of watching Richard abuse his power. Candace testified about the second and third families. Regina confirmed everything, her testimony devastating in its calm recitation of decades of wrongdoing. Morris and Leanne both took plea deals, turning on their father to save themselves. Francisco Ogden's son, now 43, finally faced charges for the hit and run that killed Thomas Dean. The statute of limitations had expired for the original crime, but new charges of conspiracy to obstruct justice had not. Richard Henderson was convicted on 17 counts of corruption, bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The judge, one who actually believed in the law, sentenced him to 23 years in federal prison. You used your position to enrich yourself while pretending to serve justice. The judge said you covered up crimes, including vehicular manslaughter for profit. You abandoned a disabled child, and created multiple families through deception. You corrupted the very system you swore to uphold. The sentence reflects the severity and duration of your crimes. Richard was 73. 23 years was effectively a life sentence. Douglas watched from the gallery as Richard was led away. No satisfaction, no triumph, just the quiet certainty that justice had finally been served. 2 years later, Douglas stood in his workshop watching Blake adjust a robotic arm prototype. His son was 17 now, heading to MIT in the fall on a full scholarship. Stephen had just finished his freshman year at Rhode Island School of Design. His portfolio of the Henderson case having earned him national recognition. Abigail, now 14, was competing in national chess tournaments and writing a blog about finding confidence after bullying. Candace appeared in the doorway. "Jennifer's here." Douglas smiled. Jennifer Morales, now Jennifer Dean, after Candace and her siblings had legally adopted her, visited twice a month. She'd moved into a supported living facility closer to the family, was working part-time as a computer programmer, and had become part of their lives in ways Richard had never imagined possible. Regina had also found her way back, slowly rebuilding relationships with her children and grandchildren. She'd sold the mansion, donated most of Richard's assets to charity, and now lived modestly, volunteering with organizations that supported disabled adults. The Henderson name had become synonymous with corruption and downfall. Morris was still serving time for his construction fraud. Lean had lost her license to practice law. Their children had changed their names, trying to escape the stigma. But the Dean family had grown stronger. "You know," Candace said, watching Blake work. "I never told you thank you for what? For seeing what I couldn't. For protecting our daughter when I was too weak to stand up to my father. For being the kind of man who fights for what's right even when it's hard." Douglas pulled her close. "I didn't do it alone." "No," she agreed. "You raised our sons to be like you. Smart, strategic, unshakable in their principles." Blake was 15 when he stood up at that dinner. 15. And he destroyed a corrupt judge with a folder full of evidence because his sister was crying. He's a good kid. He learned from the best. Abigail burst into the workshop, her chess trophy gleaming. "Dad, I won. State champion." Douglas swept her into a hug. This daughter who'd been called worthless, who'd found her strength in the aftermath of cruelty. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." "Grandpa Richard was wrong about me," she said matter-of-factly. "I'm not weak. I'm not worthless. I'm a Dean." "Yes," Douglas agreed. "You absolutely are." That evening, the family gathered for dinner, not at a mansion, not performing for cameras or navigating political landmines, but around their own table. Jennifer joined them, as did Regina, who'd become more of a grandmother in the past 2 years than she'd been in the previous lifetime. Blake raised his glass of sparkling cider. "I want to make a toast." Everyone looked at him. The son who'd started this cascade of justice with a single folder at a Christmas dinner. "To family," Blake said, "the one we choose and the one we build. To standing up for what's right, even when it's scary. And to Dad, who taught us that intelligence and patience can beat power and privilege every single time." "To Dad," they echoed. Douglas looked around the table at his family. Imperfect, complicated, but fundamentally good. Richard Henderson had spent his life accumulating power, crushing opponents, building an empire on corruption and fear. But in the end, he'd been brought down by a mechanic's son who understood that real strength came from protecting those you loved. The engineer and Douglas appreciated the symmetry. Systems had rules, and when you broke them long enough, eventually the whole structure collapsed. Richard had broken every rule, moral, legal, familial, and his empire had crumbled accordingly. Justice, Douglas had learned, wasn't always swift, but it was thorough when done right. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Former Judge Richard Henderson denied parole. Will serve full sentence. Douglas deleted it without reading further. Richard Henderson was the past. This family, this moment, this hard-won peace that was the future. Dad. Abigail tugged his sleeve. You're smiling. Just thinking, Douglas said about how sometimes the best revenge is building something better than what they tried to destroy. Deep, Blake teased. True though, Stephen added, sketching the family scene into his ever-present notebook. Candace squeezed Douglas's hand under the table, and he squeezed back partners now in ways they'd never been during the years of making excuses and keeping peace. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the world in fresh white. Inside, the Dean family laughed and talked and planned for tomorrow, secure in the knowledge that they'd face their worst and come through stronger. Richard Henderson had pointed at a 12-year-old girl and called her worthless. That girl's father had methodically destroyed him, and in doing so had taught his children that bullies always fall eventually. You just needed the courage, intelligence, and patience to engineer their downfall. Justice, Douglas Dean had proven, was just another system to master, and he'd always been very, very good with systems.